probably a big way I kind of got into this, but I don't think I ever realized it. I wanted to be, so I guess when I was in high school, I wanted to be a vet. I worked as a vet technician for about 3 years, or 2-3 years or so. And so I went and started my bachelor's in biology it was pre-vet at the time. And then it was probably my first semester of my junior year that I took an ecology class and a tropical ecology class. And I thought, hey, this stuff is kind of cool. And I started just kind of getting more and more into my ecology classes and realized that it struck a chord with me for some reason. And so I switched from biology to ecology, ethology, and evolution. And I took my limnology class, my first semester of my senior year. And I remember I was out on Forbes Lake, so if anyone, the famous Forbes Lake, for one of my field trips, and it was my limnology class that really sold me on aquatic systems. I spent a lot of time, my childhood, fishing up in northern Wisconsin with my dad, and no idea I could do something related to the outdoors as a career. So I had a graduate student I was doing research with my senior year that really kind of helped guide me towards graduate school. I knew generally I wanted to do something related to aquatic ecology, but also conservation biology. It was really important to me that the research that I did and what I pursued had some sort of broader implication in the grand scheme of things. I wanted to be able to come home and tell my parents what I did and why I did it, and made them, and convinced them it was important. So I started so that's how I just stayed at Illinois and worked on a project on a federally endangered dragonfly called the Heinz emerald dragonfly for my master's research. I worked a lot in Door County, Wisconsin. Midway through and I thought I just wanted a master's. I didn't think I wanted to go on for a PhD. And then midway through my master's advisor said to me, you need to go on for a PhD. You don't like people telling you what to do. I'm not sure whether to take that as a compliment or not, but okay. And so at that point, I knew I had kind of an interest in behavior, on species interactions, like predator-prey interactions. And so, by that point, as a master's student, I was much more aware of the research labs and what other people were doing. And so I started to identify people I really wanted to work with, not just the topic. And that drew me to my advisor, his name is Dr. Andy C., out at the University of California, Davis. And that just kind of set me off from there. And I just kind of, I knew all along, once I got in my PhD, I wanted to be in academia. I really enjoy teaching, as well as doing research, and academia was a place that afforded me kind of that freedom. And I did a number of postdocs, in part because my husband's also an academic, so we were balancing the dual career thing, which is always a challenge in academia. And so we were doing a lot of postdocs trying to find a position together, and Ohio State so far. My husband's in a 3-year position in the School of Environment and Natural Resources as well, and I'm there too. So we're hoping this is a long-term move for us, and we're really excited to be there. So that's kind of my path. Started with literally watching fish in a fish tank and naming my mollies and my tetras and writing down what they did, and you might see how that might come through here in this talk. So first, I wanted to thank you so much for this opportunity, and also the opportunity to come up here and teach. I'm largely filling in for Chris Winslow, who I guess is racing home for his wife is in labor, I guess, and so that's in part why I'm filling in for him. But then it's just great to have the opportunity to experience Stone Lab and kind of learn about the system up here. I mean, I grew up in Chicago, but I actually don't know a lot about Lake Erie. So this has been just a really great opportunity. So thank you, Jeff. All right, now down to business, right? Okay. So non-native species have definitely been shown to change the outcome, or to have a big impact on the outcome of species interactions. So is there a pointer? Is this kind of, does it have a pointer on it?
I don't know if this yours?
Yes. The top button is the laser.
Right here. Okay, thank you. So non-native species can alter the outcome of species interactions, like predator-prey interactions, competition. So some of you might be familiar with the negative impacts that non-native predators, such as, for example, the Burmese python or even domestic cats, the impacts they can have on native prey species like native birds, native small mammals, native large mammals. But interestingly and often less appreciated sometimes are the positive effects that invasive species can have on native predators. So, for example, this is a native greater scout that's enjoying a meal of non-native zebra mussels, and I'm sure many of you are very well aware of Kristen Stanford's great research on the Lake Erie water snake here, who's gorging himself on a really big invasive round goby. And in fact, there's actually a lot of increasing evidence that non-native species can serve as prey for native predators, and that sometimes native predator populations increase following the arrival of an invasive species. Now, that's not to say, though, that we should open our doors to invasive species and allow more in. Following the arrival of a potential non-native prey, predator populations might increase so much that they in turn have negative impacts on alternative native prey in the system. So they still can have, negative impacts on other aspects of the food web. The point here I'm trying to make is that the arrival of a non-native species can change the outcome of a species interactions between native and non-native species. And I think it's really important for us to understand when those interactions or when non-native species can have a positive effect or a negative effect on the native food web. And for me, I've been really interested in understanding the mechanisms. So what's going on behind the scenes in interaction between non-native species and native species. Because I think it's really important to have kind of a mechanistic understanding of what's going on in order to make, long-term predictions about the consequences of biological invasions. So in particular, I've been interested in the role of looking at the behavioral mechanisms underlying species interactions. And as of late, I've been doing a lot of work looking at the role of individual variation in traits like behavior and how they might explain interactions between non-native and native species. And so in particular, for example, what traits might allow one species to adapt and respond well and positively to changes in the fauna that it's interacting with, and what traits might be associated with species that don't do so well in adapting to changes in their environment, like changes in the species that they're interacting with. And so this might sound familiar. You might know some friends and family that you love that are more or less adaptable to change. You might know some individuals with personalities that are very adaptable in responding to new things in their environment. You might know and love some friends and family who, like this guy, a little resistant to change, a little reluctant to new changes in their environment, might not adapt so well. More familiar to you might be the idea of personality types in terms of individuals, some individuals that are more extroverted, right? So maybe like more outgoing, some individuals that are more introverted. And you can imagine maybe how personalities or individuals that are more extroverted, how they would respond to meeting a new person, as opposed to how an introvert might respond to meeting a new person. And so the same way that we might study personality and personality types in humans, there's been a big increase in interest in applying this framework and understanding how personalities of non-human animals might affect the outcome of species interactions. And this emerging field of study is known as the study of animal personality, or also often called the study of behavioral syndrome. And the idea is that there are these consistent individual differences among non-human animals, so these consistent personality types within non-human animals that can have really big impacts on different ecological or evolutionary processes. So this individual variation in kind of personality within non-human animals is very similar to a very fundamental idea in ecology and evolution, that genetic variation within a population is really important in terms of how that species or how that population might adapt to changes in its environment. The focus here, though, instead of on the genes, is on, is on ecologically important behavioral traits, so i.e. the personality type of individuals within a population of, let's say, fish. And so the gist of it is, or the bottom line, is that if you've got more variation in behavioral types or personality among individuals within a population, this might allow a species then to do well across a broad range of environmental conditions, or do well in the face of changes in their environment. So there's a lot of evidence that a lot of non-human animals do indeed have personality. So there's been a lot of evidence in crabs, in birds, in pigs. You can imagine personalities of your dogs and cats, right? And fish. So how many of you fish for northern pike? Anyone? Right? How many of you know that northern pike have personalities? They do. So some work I did when I was at the University of Illinois before I came to Ohio State with Drs. Katie McGee and Dr. Allison Bell, we were doing some work on northern pike and found that northern pike vary in how flexible they are in responding to changes in their environments. So in particular, we found that we had some individuals that are really flexible, but there's a consequence of this flexibility. So some individuals are really flexible, but they're actually not very good performers as predators. They don't do as well at capturing prey. Whereas there are some individuals in that population that are less flexible, but that are actually really high-performing predators. They're really good at capturing their prey. They capture them really quick, and they're very efficient and effective. We think this individual variation within the population of northern pike might actually contribute to its success as an invasive species out west. So here, northern pike are native. I grew up fishing for them, thinking that they're native, but on the west coast, they're wreaking havoc. They've been introduced into a lot of aquatic ecosystems, and they're having really big impacts on native prey populations. And we think there's, again, variation in their, for example, here, how flexible or how adaptable they are might contribute to their ability to invade into novel environments as far west as Northern California, Oregon, for example. So more recently, or the last couple years, I've also been applying this framework of animal personality or behavioral syndromes to understanding when and why native predators might be able or may not respond to novel invasive prey coming into their environment. So in other words, we've got native predators. A lot of times these invasive species come in, they're potential prey, but sometimes native predators eat them, other times they don't. And what explains this variation? Is there individual differences in personality that might explain when a native predator might adopt a novel food source into its diet? And I've been doing this in the context of a relatively recent invasion of this green porcelain crab called Petrolistes armatus. Petrolistes armatus, really pretty crab, is native to South America, but was introduced into Northern California back in about 1995. Since then, it's been invading up the Georgia coast and is now as far north as the Georgia-South Carolina coast. It's a filter-feeding crab species that's invaded into really commercially important oyster reef communities, and it directly competes with a lot of filter-feeding oysters and native mussels. One of the things, one of the reasons that it's thought that these invasive crabs, these green porcelain crabs, might do so well is because they've escaped the control of their natural enemies. That in their new environment, they kind of leave their predators behind, and there aren't that many predators in their new environment that are able to control their abundances. And in these oyster reef communities, the predator that we're interested in is called the common mud crab, Panopeus urbstii. The common mud crab is a really widespread predator along the Atlantic coast in these oyster reefs. They have a very broad generalist diet, but they don't seem to be controlling Petrolistes. And so again, we're interested in understanding if there are individual differences, personality in these native mud crabs that might cause them to kind of be a little bit deterred in adopting this this novel prey into their diet. There is some work, however, that was done by some folks out of Georgia Tech showing, though, that these native mud crab predators will consume this novel invasive prey. And in fact, oftentimes they'll consume them in higher abundances than some of their alternative native prey that are in their environment. But even though these native mud crabs will seem to consume this invasive prey, these invasive prey can reach densities of about 11,000 crabs per meter square. That's a lot of crabs in a section of oyster reef. So again, the question is, why are these native predators not able to control the abundances of this invasive filter-feeding crab? And so the idea here is, again, that there might be individual variation within that population of native predators that might contribute to their inability to presumably to control this invasive prey. So what we're interested in looking at is whether or not there's variation within the diet of those native mud crab predators that might contribute to them not readily consuming invasive prey. So even though these predators have a really broad diet, so they're generalist predators, they eat everything. They have a really broad general diet. But there's actually a lot of increasing evidence that even though a species might have a really broad diet, the individuals within that population might actually be more so like a bunch of individual specialists. So even though you have a generalist species, that generalist species might be made up of a bunch of individuals that all eat different things, and collectively together, that's what makes that species have a generalist diet. The implications for controlling a non-native prey is that if there are a bunch of individual specialists in your population, you might only have, let's say, 10% of that population of predators consuming your invasive prey. And maybe that's why, because you don't have all the individuals in that population consuming the prey, that's why these invasive species are able to escape the control of their natural enemies. So again, this individual variation. And so to look at whether or not there was individual variation in the diet of these native mud crab predators, we ran two different diet choices, just really simple diet choice assays. We gave a native mud crab, ran one experiment where we gave a native mud crab predator a choice among native mussels, native clams, and then native crabs, along with the non-native invasive prey. And we looked to see, okay, what proportion of each individual's diet was made up of that invasive Petrolystes. And then we ran another diet assay where we only gave the native mud crab predators Petrolystes, and we looked to see, well, who will consume them, who won't, and who will eat a lot of them, and who will eat a few of them. And what we found is that even though, again, these native mud crabs have these really broad, are known to have these really broad generalist diets, we get a lot of individual variation in what these individual mud crab predators will eat. So what we found is that 44.5% of the population will specialize on native mussels. They'll eat nothing but native mussels, even when you give them a choice among alternative food. 38% of those individuals had a mixed diet. So 38% of the population did seem to have that broader generalized diet. But then we had 14% of the population that specialized on the non-native prey, would eat nothing else but that non-native prey, even though they had the option of consuming things that were really familiar to them. And then 3.5% of the population ate a mix of mussels and Petrolystes. So the bottom line is we have these native mud crab predators, some that will just readily munch down and consume the invasive prey, and others that almost seem like they don't even recognize them. So this guy here has an invasive prey right on its face, won't even touch it. So what explains this variation? Are there behaviors? Is there a personality type associated with these individuals that won't touch Petrolystes and those that'll chow down and even specialize on them? And so what we did is, like Animal Planet, we stick them in tanks and we watch their behavior. A little bit more scientific than that, but that's kind of how I like to think about it. So we took each of these individual mud crabs that we already knew what they ate. We looked to see how exploratory they were in a novel environment. We put them in a novel environment. We looked to see how much they are willing to move around and explore a novel environment. We look to see how bold they are, and boldness tends to be a personality type that has been increasingly found in a lot of, again, non-human animals. So we look to see how bold they were. And then we look to see how aggressive they are. Crabs if you've ever tried to grab a crab, they love to do that claw raise, exactly, Doug. They do that claw raise, just like crayfish at you. Some individuals will readily claw raise, others will cower and back away. And so we use this to kind of assess how aggressive they were. And then we also recorded how big they were and then what their gender was, were they male or female. So ran a bunch of statistical tests, and what we found was that, I'll start with the simultaneous choice assay. So the assay where we gave them a choice of food, a smorgasbord, looked to see what they ate. What we found was that individuals that either specialized or had a really large proportion of the invasive prey in their diet were individuals that were pretty much, so I'll just tell you, the graph actually isn't showing it correctly, but there were individuals that were female. So females either specialized or had a large proportion of the invasive prey in their diet. These individuals also tended to be smaller, and they also tended to be less aggressive. When you gave them no choice, only gave them the invasive prey, what we found was that individuals that were not really willing to explore, kind of shy and less exploratory, were less aggressive, and also tended to be female, tended to be the ones that would eat the most number, the highest number of the invasive prey. So what we found between the two assays is that in general, individuals that either have a large proportion of those invasive prey in their diet or will just readily consume them when given no choice are usually individuals that are less exploratory, less aggressive, smaller, and females. And what we think is going on is that individuals that are not very good competitors might be getting pushed off into consuming this non-native prey. Females, I'll just note, females tend to be a little bit smaller than males, and in crabs, just like crayfish, they set up these dominance hierarchies and interactions that are where size really makes a big difference. Smaller individuals just don't fare as well in competitive interactions. And so again, what we think is that competition or in order to reduce competition, these individuals that might be more subordinate, so smaller, female, less exploratory, less aggressive, they might switch to eating Petrolisthes to avoid the costs of competing for the more preferred native prey. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence showing that as food becomes limiting, individuals should actually diversify their diets in order to reduce competition. And so what we think is that even though the arrival of this non-native prey appears to kind of be overall kind of increasing the overall abundance of prey in the environment, what it might be doing is actually altering the encounter rate with preferred native prey, so that these native crabs are actually perceiving a decline in the native prey species, and this might be driving them to kind of diversify their diets in order to reduce the effect of competition. So that's why you have some individuals diversifying their diets to specialize on that non-native prey in order to reduce the negative impacts of competition for their preferred prey. So we also think, and one other point I wanted to make here is that this also actually implies that the Petrolisthes, the invasive prey, actually might be the less preferred or maybe less profitable prey item. Because if they were the profitable prey item, you'd think that actually the bold, kind of aggressive, more competitively dominant individuals would be going after those and specializing them. But the fact that it's the subordinate individuals that seem to be going after the invasive prey kind of implies that these actually might be crappy food, pretty much. And so that's why one of the reasons why these invasive crabs might be able to reach these ridiculously high abundances in these oyster reefs. And so we think this really might have pretty important implications for the invasion success of Petrolisthes. So as I kind of mentioned before, if there's only a few individuals in the population that are consuming this invasive prey, even though we've got this generalist native mud crab predator, because there's this individual variation, there only seem to be about 14% of the population that will readily consume this invasive prey. And this might be one reason why this, again, this Petrolisthes has maybe kind of gone out of control, because there's not enough of the native predators that are controlling their abundances. Over time, predation pressure might change, right, as these native predators either learn to consume the Petrolisthes in their diet. Maybe there's some aspect of learning to consume them that they need, and over time, predation pressure might change. But again, because there's evidence that these Petrolisthes might be not very profitable prey items, it might not be until more of the native predators perceive declines in their native prey and their preferred prey that you'll get more native predators kind of turning to consume these Petrolisthes. And so I just wanted to, so this is work that I've been doing down on the Georgia coast, but why does it matter here potentially in Lake Erie? So what I've been hoping to do and hoping to start in this summer is looking at the effect of non-native species as prey on maybe some Lake Erie native predators. And one in particular, so actually a lot of my background is on invasive crayfish. I've done a lot of work on invasive crayfish. And so I'm interested in maybe starting to work on the red swamp crayfish, which is not as prevalent as probably the rusty crayfish you guys all know, but has been creeping up and expanding its populations in more northern climates than it was expected. These guys are really big problems over in Europe, out on the west coast as well. Could potentially, if they continue to adapt to the climate here, might become potential problems here, particularly in some of the coastal wetlands. And so I'm kind of interested in maybe using this as a system to understand maybe individual variation in some of our important native fish predators in Lake Erie, and seeing when they might be able to adapt and adopt to novel prey items, and then hopefully ultimately control maybe the invasion success of the red swamp crayfish. With that, I said I wanted to make sure I acknowledge my collaborators on the crab work. So Dr. Jeb Byers at the University of Georgia, who is my collaborator on that project, and Lauren Hofstad is a master's student who's been working with me at OSU and focusing her master's project on this her master's work on this oyster project as well. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Dr. Pintor?
Yeah, I was pointing at Kristen. Sorry, I'll get you.
Have you looked to see if the behaviors are being passed from mother to offspring, or if they're genetically related?
Yeah, not in the crabs, but actually some of the work I was doing on interactions between three-spine stickleback and northern pike was actually a lot on that, was actually looking at the effect of personality and maternal stress on the success and personality type of their offspring. So there's a lot of evidence actually in humans, right, that when moms are stressed out, it can have a negative effect on their babies and potentially affect their kind of personality types. And we were doing some work like that on three-spine stickleback, actually showing that stress does have a negative impact on offspring and tends to kind of shift and shape the variation you see in offspring. But I haven't in the crabs, though. But yeah.
So you showed a lot with crustaceans. How far do you think this goes? Like, can planaria have personalities?
So there are folks that were working on Drosophila, fruit flies, looking at individual variation, in part because they're interested kind of at what Kristen was getting at, whether or not there was like a genetic component where the influence of personality can pass down from generation to generation. So when you work on things like Drosophila, which have a really rapid generation time, you can track generation after generation. So they picked it up in Drosophila. Trying to think, I had thought someone was actually trying to work on it on C. elegans, again, another species where there's a lot known. You can look at these longer-term evolutionary implications of personality.
How do you quantify something like aggression or stress?
Yeah, so aggressive. So the way I quantify aggressive behavior, I've done this a lot in crayfish. I've done this a lot in crabs. And I model it off of a lot of work that's been done on lobster behavior, where we, for example, will stage interactions, and we're able to score. So crayfish and crabs, when they're in an aggressive interaction, they have a ritualized set of behaviors that they do where that interaction escalates from kind of one step to the next to the next. So they'll start with kind of, for example, like a face-off, and kind of look at each other and assess like who's dominant, who's subordinate. That doesn't solve it. They often start flicking their antennae at each other. So they'll literally start flicking their antennae. If that doesn't resolve it, then they start pushing each other. If that doesn't resolve it, then they start grabbing at each other. So there's a really nice ritualized set of behaviors that we can score and use that as a way to characterize the aggressive behavior of an individual. Stress, so the way we were actually using hormones to measure stress. We were looking at levels of cortisol in the fish to measure stress. Yeah.
Have your crabs impacted the oyster population?
There's mixed evidence. So they're not sure if they're directly competing or not. What they're actually concerned with is that the crabs are filter feeding the oyster and the mussel, or the oyster larvae, basically. So they're depleting them, they're not competing necessarily with them, but they're actually almost like predators on some of the larvae. But there's mixed evidence right now of how much of a direct effect, or a direct competitive effect, they're having on the native oyster population.
Very good. Thank you very much. With that, I think we're going to move to our guest lecture tonight, and I'm real pleased to have I'm real pleased to have Gail Hesse from the Lake Erie Commission. Gail is the executive director at the Lake Erie Commission, and has spent, prior to that position, spent 30 years with U.S. EPA. I'm sorry, Ohio EPA. Get this right. But an interesting background in Gail's case. Gail grew up in New York, New Jersey, and back to the kind of questions that I asked Dr. Pintor at the beginning, Gail. From New York, New Jersey, you went to Ohio University. Yeah. You know, how did you make that decision? BS in geography, Master of Science in Environmental Studies. The whole time she was at Ohio EPA working at water issues, water-related issues, water planning issues, and ended up really managing the Lake Erie program and the Inland Lakes program at Ohio EPA before becoming the executive director of the Lake Erie Commission. You could also tell us a little bit more about what the Lake Erie Commission is and what all it entails, including the Lake Erie Protection Fund, which a number of the faculty members and people from agencies here might be involved very much with that. Gail was the chair of the Ohio Phosphorus Task Force, the first Phosphorus Task Force, and is now the co-chair of the second Phosphorus Task Force. We're all really anxious. You guys have a report that's going to come out very, very soon here. She's also the one of the Ohio commissioners on the Great Lakes Commission, a graduate of the Ohio Certified Public Management Program. And from a student standpoint, this would be explain sort of this in your background. She's a past board member of the International Youth Hostel Program, or Youth Program of the Hostel Organization. And people that understand that. And then, again, the kind of questions I asked Dr. How did you pick, water issues? How did you pick these schools, these majors? And I know you've had, this was an interesting decision process, and I think this will surprise you if you hear how Gail did some of this. You're going to tell us some about the policy recommendations.
And then I'll get to the other talk. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. And please welcome, and please join me in welcoming Gail Hesse, Executive Director of Lake Erie.
Thanks, Jeff. One of the questions that Jeff asked me earlier today was, well, why geography? In addition to sort of how did you end up in Ohio, but why geography? Well, the Ohio connection was just at the end of high school, my father got transferred to Toledo. So he got called to the mothership of the corporation that he worked for. But why geography? And I was partway through my undergraduate work and did not have a major, but then I took a long-distance bicycle trip out to Colorado and back one summer, and realized that what I was really interested in was landforms, landscape, and how the world changes over time. Being on a bicycle gives you for a long period of time, on a day after day after day basis, gives you a very different perspective of the world around you. So I literally came home from that trip and looked up in an encyclopedia what geography meant. And when I read it, it was just an epiphany. It was like, that's it. That's what I'm going to study. And then throughout my career, just ended up in the water programs. And my first job after graduate school was at Ohio EPA. And I'd like to say that I had a very different type of career at Ohio EPA than many of my counterparts, in that at Ohio EPA I worked with so many technical specialists that I stood in awe of the depths of their knowledge, whether they were aquatic scientists, plant ecologists, engineers, attorneys. But that really wasn't what I gravitated towards in terms of an individual specialty. What I ended up being able to do was being able to help make the connections among them. and also sometimes to be the translator of what they were really trying to say. And then, and so ended up in my career knowing a little bit about a lot of things. And when you're one of the few people that can do that in an organization, that's really where you sort of find your niche, you know, and you can find where you can sort of add to the value added part of that. So the Lake Erie Commission is a consortium of 6 state agencies that work together to coordinate policies and programs on behalf of Lake Erie. So that's the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Natural Resources, Transportation, Health, and Development. And so, it's while each of those agencies have all their individual mandates and authorities, the value of the commission is that it's an opportunity through the commission staff is to work together to coordinate or to sort of pool their individual mandates, but to pool that and coordinate it on behalf of the lake, because they all of their mandates individually affect the lake, but it's the coordination of the whole that can make a difference. So, again, I would like to say thank you to Jeff and to thank you for all of you for being here tonight. Whenever I have a chance to come here for an event or a meeting of some sort, it's always an opportunity for my husband, who's sitting in the back of the room, to say, well, can we sail over? Can we sail over? So our boat is right out off the near the dock of right off the lab here at Mooring Ball A5, and so it's always a pleasure to be here, but it's also a pleasure to get here. So, on the boat. And so this evening I've got a few introductory slides that will talk a little bit, just as a warm up, to talk about why we need to be talking about phosphorus and the Lake Erie Phosphorus Task Force. I'm sure all of you know about the issues that we're having with algal blooms in the western and sometimes the central basin, also known as harmful algal blooms. And the task force was convened to really begin to address those issues. But I also like to start out just with a couple of slides of what's great about the Great Lakes, and since it's summer, to think about the summer fun that we have in and around the Great Lakes, in all of its moods, and in all of its seasons. And so, but we also know that as much fun as we have on the lake, we've got some pretty serious issues that we're dealing with. And historically, I know some of you have seen some of these slides. This is a very old picture from the Cuyahoga River burning, and in Cleveland, and how that spurred the whole an environmental movement in conjunction with the oil spill out in Santa Barbara and the resulting Clean Water Act. And then, of course, the issues that we've had in Lake Erie, and the infamous picture of Dr. Reuter's hand that continues to be shown, because it's so instructive in terms of a lesson to us all, in terms of where we have been and where we have come from. And but at that time, in that era, Lake Erie the issues with Lake Erie were so serious it had become a bit of a national joke, and on national television. So that to the point where even Dr. Seuss had something to say about Lake Erie. And that is, those of you familiar with the Lorax? Well, this is a verse from the Lorax, and this was a sentence that was in the book at the end of one of the verses. I hear things are just as bad up in Lake Erie. Well, in the early 1990s, at that point, the lake had, in large measure, was cleaned up. It was in a completely different place than what it was from the 1970 eras of the algae that we just saw. In 1991, Dr. Seuss was still alive, and I've heard 2 different versions of the story, but one was that a class in Ohio with their teacher sent a letter to Dr. Seuss and said that the lake's been cleaned up. This doesn't serve us or Lake Erie well at all, and he agreed to take that sentence out. So in all editions of the Lorax since 1991, you will not see that sentence in the book. So it's actually become quite a collector's item to find a copy of the Lorax pre-1991, and because you will see that sentence in there, and they go on free. They're sold on eBay for several $100s, just so you know. So look through those old books.
Yeah, let me interrupt for just a second, because it just so happens that the person that got that change.
Really?
Yeah.
That's you. Well, what an honor to be here. Thank you. what history tells us is that when we've had significant issues in Lake Erie, that if we make the right changes, that we can make a difference, and that we can see improvements in the lake. And clearly we've got issues now with the algal blooms that we've seen that have reemerged in the mid-1990s, and we've seen some particularly bad blooms in recent years. So as I mentioned, that was what prompted the convening of the Phosphorus Task Force. And I've got this one slide to talk a little bit about what's needed, because what I like to say about where we are now is sort of equivalent to any recovery program, in that we've gone from awareness to denial to acceptance and now on to action. But in terms of what's the action that we need, it's really a combination of three things. Certainly we need the on-the-ground implementation because of what we know about where the phosphorus is coming from and what's feeding those algal blooms. And that's both whether it's on the private side or through public sector funding. We need the research to be able to continue to answer some of the unanswered questions that we still have about what's happening. How phosphorus moves through the soil, how it gets delivered to the stream, what's happening in our stream hydrology, in the nearshore area of the lake, and certainly the open lake. But we also need some robust monitoring programs so that in our tributaries, nearshore and to open lake, so that we can hopefully be looking at the progress of change as we begin to take these actions on the ground, how they result in changes, and we can be able to, and hopefully document that with monitoring programs. But we also need other analytic efforts like the Phosphorus Task Force, work groups, workshops, symposiums, because these all serve a purpose in being able to share information, exchange what we know, and most importantly, to build consensus on what we need to do differently. Because it's only where we have consensus where we will see action. And so these all serve a purpose in helping to educate one another about what we know, but also about what we believe in terms of what will make a difference. So how I'll talk about the task force this evening is I'll come at it from essentially three perspectives. The approach that we've taken as a group, a little bit of the content, give you a sense of the items and the topics that we have discussed and deliberated on as a task force, and then also share with you some of the recommendations. As Dr. Reuter mentioned, we are in the process of finalizing our final report, which will be coming out in August. And so we are working on those last details of putting together, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and making sure that we have all our references correct. And Dr. Herdendorf has helped to provide some of that information to us as well. This was a copy of the report from the first task force. Jeff mentioned that there was a Phosphorus Task Force 1. That was a group, we convened that group in 2007. We published this report in 2010. Jack was on that task force, as was Jeff. And so that was a pretty pivotal piece in that was the effort that really took a comprehensive look at what all of the potential sources of phosphorus were. So we looked at all of the sources, both point source, non-point sources, and our intention with that effort was to identify the relative contributions from those different sources. And it was also at the time coming to acknowledge through the work of Heidelberg University and the monitoring program that they have about how the issue has really shifted towards dissolved reactive phosphorus. All along, most of our monitoring programs have looked at total. It was Heidelberg that really brought to light the issue related to dissolved reactive phosphorus. And so while we looked at a whole variety of different sources, point sources being a critical one that everyone wanted to know about, and the reality is that point sources, while are all in large measure within their discharging phosphorus within their permit limits. And what we were looking for was what had changed since the mid-1990s, because that was when we started to see the reemergence of the algal blooms. And with the majority of the land use, over 80% of the land use being agriculture in northwest Ohio from both the Maumee and the Sandusky basins, we knew that agriculture was the prevailing source. But it was an interesting conundrum of what we identified in that task force is that it really was less about how much is applied, but how it is applied. in that, the actual, when we looked at some of the, at a gross level, looking at fertilizer sales, how much manure is land applied, that sort of thing, all of those numbers have gone down. So the actual amount of being put out there on the landscape had actually has been reduced, but it's about how and when it was going on. Fall and winter application, broadcast application on those fields, being much more susceptible to runoff, particularly in storm events. Because the other piece of what we learned was that this is delivered through storm events, through those pulses of storms, and that we are seeing the pattern of more frequent, higher intensity storms, and that's clearly exacerbating what we're finding. And then it's also important to acknowledge that while we probably have hot spots, with some areas that we could focus on and identify, but it's also a reality that those hot spots shift and move. Agricultural producers make decisions, operational decisions, on a field that change from year to year, based on crop rotations, based on tillage methods, based on a whole variety of factors. So that really, while there are hot spots, there's also probably a little bit coming from a large area, coming off of a large area. So that was our sort of all of, in a snapshot, what came out of the first task force. But wanted to now shift into talking about sort of phase 2 and our overall approach. With the composition of the group, we had researchers from several different universities, including Dr. Reuter, different water resource and agricultural agency representatives, both at the state, federal, and local level. This time, because we wanted to really focus and dig a little deeper on agriculture, brought in more members from the agricultural industry, as well as non-governmental organizations. And we even had a representative from the lawn care industry on the task force as well. And so our task this time was a little bit different. Our task was to develop reduction targets to track future progress. The idea being, how much do we need to reduce by to see a difference in the algal blooms? And then also to look at new and emerging data and information. There's new information, even since 2010, it was very interesting that how much more information was becoming available as the algal blooms have become such a focal point for so many disciplines and stakeholders. And then ultimately to develop some policy and management recommendations. So how did we approach our work? So the task force itself did not do any monitoring or any modeling through our process. But what we did do was look at peer-reviewed publications, and that was brought to us by a number of different task force members on a variety of different topics. But we also brought in experts on different topics of different content. And so depending on what the task force wanted to identify, we would bring someone in to make a presentation. But how we utilized that information, it was important, too, to have a successful outcome for the task force. One of the things I've learned in working with groups is that you never want to ask a group to make a decision on information that they've just been presented with. And this is why some of these processes can take time, because what we would do is have information brought before the task force, whether it was through publications or whether it was from a content expert coming as a guest to the task force, present that at another meeting then, at a subsequent meeting then, have the deliberation. What are the implications? What does that mean? What did that tell us? How is that important and relevant to what we need to know? And then also sometimes it would take another meeting yet, and sometimes a couple of meetings after that, to actually develop recommendations. It's part of what consultants will call soak time, that information sort of needs to soak in about, to be able to process it, and to be able to exchange the ideas about how do we utilize that to turn that into a recommendation for what we need to do differently. And in fact, opinion and guess, all three of these play an important role in any dialogue. And certainly as scientists, we all gravitate towards facts. They can be replicated, they can be proven, and they're important to us. And each of these three have their value and have their downsides. The downside with facts is that a group can get stuck in the whole analysis paralysis because you never have enough information to get to a decision point that you need to get to. But on the other hand, facts are important because they can be proven, they're replicatable, etc. Opinion is important when you're trying to develop consensus, because where opinion fits in all of this is that it's, while someone may believe something, the critical question to ask is why. And I've heard one consultant say that sometimes it takes 4 levels of why to get to the gist of where that individual perspective is coming from. And so that takes time to sort of kind of keep pushing through that. All of us hold opinions, and all of us can be and have strongly held opinions, but being able to exchange that and make it useful to the dialogue of a group takes effort and kind of going through those layers of why. And then while guess feels like, well, that's just speculation, it can also be the richest source of innovation for when questions get asked like, well, but how about, or what if, and following on, and so that's where some of the ideas get generated. I've heard one consultant talk about this, about facts, opinion, and guess as lifting the fog of dialogue, because it's important to know in a process like a task force effort is where are you? Where is the discussion of from any particular individual and for any particular meeting, and to be able to do the diagnosis of that, to be able to figure out what are the key nuggets of what we need to take to be able to move us forward. And then finally, what we have stayed true to is a consensus-based approach, and that's always easier said than done, and sometimes takes more time because it does mean we've had to cycle back to issues as people will be comfortable with it at one meeting, but then want to bring it back at a subsequent meeting because something has come up for them. So it's again important to pay attention as much to the process of a group like the task force as much as it is important to pay attention to the science of it. So content. So what are the kinds of things that we talked about through the work of the task force? We certainly wanted to update the water quality and algal bloom information. 2011 and 2012 gave us a remarkable comparison and put in dramatic relief the kinds of issues that we're dealing with. In that, 2011 was the worst year we had ever seen. It had moved into the Central Basin. And then followed by 2012 and the drought year. And we just saw a fraction of the bloom in 2012. And again, sort of helped to reinforce the notion that at whatever point that we can turn down the tap of phosphorus delivery into the lake, we'll see a change. Just as we did after the efforts put into place in the 70s and early 80s, and the resulting good years of what we saw before the reemergence. And as I mentioned earlier, part of our task was to develop those targets for load reduction. We also updated and included information on progress and costs of the point source reductions. A couple of items related to this include the combined sewer overflows. There are what we call CSO communities along the lake and in the Ohio Lake Erie watershed, where it's the stormwater discharge is combined with the sewage. And when we have high storm events, we see we can see some pretty high loading. So what we did was looked at all of those permitted dischargers in the Lake Erie Basin. We looked at all of the CSO communities have what's called a long-term control plan, which is negotiated either between the state of Ohio or with U.S. EPA, sometimes through a consent decree or some other judicial processes. But all of the Lake Erie communities are all under a lake long-term control plan. The issue is that some of these long-term control plans are really long-term, and so while they could be out to 2030, 2035, 30 and 40-year time horizons before we'll see the final, some of these fully addressed. But in the meantime, they're making significant progress. Billions have literally been invested in CSO control in Ohio communities, and it's important to remember. We've looked at some of those numbers and what those reductions that have been achieved to date. And then certainly we looked at nutrient management and mitigating practices, and this is specific to agriculture. And a couple of questions or issues that emerged of particular note are drainage management, in that Northwest Ohio, with its flat terrain and tight clay soils, is heavily tile drained. And so, in particular, the administration of Ohio EPA, ODNR, and agriculture really asked the task force for us to take a closer look at that. And then through all of this, a key issue emerged on soil health, and we'll take a little bit of a look at that. But first, I just wanted to share with you that comparison of 2011, and here's 2011, and this is the cumulative dissolved reactive phosphorus load. This is a graph put together by Pete Richards at Heidelberg University, and you can see this is in metric tons, and here's 2011, again, way off the charts in terms of cumulative load, and the green line down here being 2012. Here we are in 2013. I think we ended up just right around 250, I think. And then here's the average. But that comparison, again, was just so instructive. So drainage management. So when we talk about drainage management, we're talking about both subsurface and subsurface drainage. And that, again, in the situation unique to Ohio, in that because of the heavily tile drained acreage. And what we had also knew, but this was only based on anecdotal information, that tile density was increasing. So that where tiles had formerly been placed anywhere from 15, 20, 30 feet apart are now getting spaced 10 and 15 feet apart. And so increasing that fast delivery of that drainage water to the stream, to the lake. But interestingly enough, there are new structures, what we call drainage management structures, that are emerging that are beneficial to reducing nutrient loss from fields. And some of this are some things called tile risers. There's things called blind inlets that sort of work as a French drain. There's gypsum treatments that are being used. But essentially, collecting that drainage water, that flow from the tile, and putting them through a structure that ameliorates both the quantity of flow as well as reducing the phosphorus content. What we did, there's been a lot of work done around, not little done in Ohio, but a lot done around, not just in the U.S., but globally. And so one of our task force members, Kevin King, with the Agricultural Research Station, had done a pretty thorough literature review of what research was out there about drainage management structures. And the good news is that they are showing some promise, and that these are structures that we need to be paying closer attention to. The issue that we came up to was that there's very little data specific to Ohio, and that this was a need of what we needed to look at in more depth. And we also needed to be looking at these drainage management structures under different flow regimes, because their effectiveness is really dependent on their ability to handle the flow that comes through them. But we did take a stab at some calculations, and this is helpful in terms of scale. And when we talk about what we're talking about, the Maumee Basin alone is 4.5 million acres, but there's 1.3 acres of what's classified as very poorly and poorly drained soils in the Maumee and the Sandusky Basin. If we were to look at one structure per 30 acres, that's a little over 44,000 structures across the landscape. But then we thought, all right, so realistically, what could we think about going in? So we look at just arbitrarily take 25%, a little over 11,000 structures, at about $2,000 of a cost per structure. And so even just that alone is a cost of $22 million. So again, just kind of a sense of scale of what would it take, and how much could we, and what it would take, and how much could we really expect to happen. But it's also acknowledging that our public sector programs aren't going to be able to necessarily cover this, but that it's going to need to be a combination over time. As I mentioned, soil health really emerged as a critical issue that hadn't gotten much attention before, and it has recently emerging in a variety of fronts about the role that it plays with regards to nutrient management. soil, certainly with nutrient cycling, biodiversity, filtering, buffering, physical stability, and support. And what we know about Northwest Ohio soils and that tight clay composition is that they are fragile, and they're very prone to compaction, which, in addition to a variety of other things, compromises filtering capacity. So what happens with that is that it creates what's called preferential flows through macropores, through cracks in the soil, as opposed to matrix flow, which is the infiltration of the water through the soil profile. One task force member said, we can manage our way out of poor soil health by applying more fertilizer and by increasing our tillage, but that's not going to solve the problems that we have. And so that we really need to be messaging with the agricultural community about the importance of soil health as an approach, not a practice, but an approach to addressing nutrient reduction. And so there's a whole suite of recommendations in our report that talk about how to promote soil health in terms of what does that mean, limiting soil disturbance, that there is a way to apply fertilizer without broadcast application where it can be banded or injected into the soil profile, essentially making that fertilizer, putting that fertilizer in contact with the soil, but without doing excessive runs of equipment over the farm field, and without compromising the compaction issues, and certainly to increase organic matter. So, in terms of recommendations, the first set of recommendations I wanted to share with you were about the target load reductions. This was a subcommittee of the task force that was led by Dr. Reuter, and bringing in a couple of other external parties to that subcommittee. And what became important, and this was with the work of also NOAA in Maryland, that was responsible for the poster on the board over here, is that the key point of delivery is the March through June time period. Well, typically frequently spring gets defined as April through June. What we know is that it's what gets delivered in that time period in any given year. It's the large determining factor for what kind of an algal bloom we'll have in the summer. I think 90% of the load gets delivered through March, in that period, March through June. So the approach, again, led by Jeff, about how to approach targets, was that we looked at an average, a reduction in a multi-year average load, instead of what sort of peak do we want to, just a single year peak that we want to reduce by, because that would be an impossible number to identify, but that the time frame of the average that we picked was 2007 through 2012. We felt that those years were the most representative of the kinds of loads and impacts that we would likely be seeing into the future, predicted increases in the frequency of severe storms. And so again, looking at that reduction in multi-year average, we took that average of 2007 and 2012, and I'll show you what those numbers look like. But what was important is that while we got great data because of Heidelberg on the Maumee and the Sandusky, we also know from the work of Heidelberg and others is that the unit area loads from watersheds outside of the Maumee and the Sandusky that drain into the Western Basin have similar loading on a unit area basis, similar loads to the Western Basin. So these recommendations, while we can track this utilizing the data from the Maumee and the Sandusky, but that really from a percentage standpoint that any actions that are taken need to apply to all of the watersheds between Monroe, Michigan and Sandusky, Ohio. So what do those numbers look like? So we looked at both dissolved reactive phosphorus and total phosphorus. So I mentioned those average years of 2007 to 2012, and so that is 256 tons. The recommended target is 150, and so that would represent a 41% reduction from the average. So a 41% reduction from that 256. We were intentional about not recommending any annual loading targets for dissolved reactive phosphorus because that March through June time period, we know is the the critical time period that we needed to consider. For total, on the other hand, we did look at both spring and annual. We took the same years for the average, knowing that the spring is 1275, the annual is 2630, 2630, and then identified the targets for spring for 800 tons and the annual of 1600 tons. And similarly, we're in the 37 to 39% reduction from the average. So as a subcommittee and as a task force, felt that 39 to 41%, that's substantive, but also feels achievable. And that what we also believe is that would represent a significant reduction in the algal blooms that we're seeing. We're not saying absolute elimination, we're saying significant reduction. And that if we can achieve those kind of targets on a multi-year basis, that we will be seeing a marked difference in the algal blooms. But in the next breath, with identifying these numbers, is the notion that for this to work, we need to keep an open mind as to what our patterns will be in the future, and that we need to take an adaptive approach to this. That we're going to need robust monitoring so that we can track this over time and see what we're doing, but also understand that we might need to change these percentages and change these targets once we learn more going forward. And so to adapt as we need to, as more and more research comes to the forefront, as we get a longer, more years of patterns to analyze, but that again, this is what we know now. This is what we believe will achieve a significant reduction. So on the ag practices side of things, the notion of avoid controlled traps. This was something that's been talked about in the Mississippi River Basin, that act, because there are practices that avoid nutrient runoff, or avoid any sort of risk of runoff. Others that control it. And there's also trapping practices, and that trapping speaks to a lot of the drainage management structures that I spoke to, in that a lot of it's about nutrient management, but it's also about managing that flow off the field. And so that we have an opportunity in our, whether it's through some wetlands restoration or some stream restoration, that can help to ameliorate that nutrient delivery. But in terms of the 7 super strategies, the soil testing has become an ever important tool. And this was identified in the first task force to do more of them and more frequently, to get more coverage and to do them more frequently than what had been a typical practice in the agricultural community. The Tri-State Fertility Guide is a document that's developed at Tri-State, is Ohio State University, Purdue, and Michigan State University, that have fertility recommendations for agriculture. And those guides still hold and are important and need to be followed. And so as nutrient management plans get written, we're just strongly recommending that the fertility guide continue to be at the forefront that guides those nutrient management decisions. Certainly no application on snow-covered or frozen ground, getting away from that winter application. But also fertilizer placement to ensure contact with the soil. Avoid broadcast application. Make sure that fertilizer comes in contact with the soil profile, whether it's through banding or injection through side casting. The soil health recommendations to increase filtration, reduce runoff, managing that tile drainage to minimize the transport, and the trapping practices to slow down, retain that runoff. Because we know the phosphorus gets delivered in these storm pulsed events, the more that we can, again, slow down that flow, the more that we think we can make, that will help make a difference in that delivery to the lake. Another key piece of this, in a lot of the discussions with the agricultural community, we've talked about, because we want to get away from broadcast application, it often got translated into what's referred to as incorporating that fertilizer into the soil. But we also discovered there's an issue by using that term and with that terminology, because many agricultural producers were interpreting that to mean that we need to go back to full tillage. Over the last 30 years, we've made tremendous strides in shifting away from what's called full inversion tillage to conservation tillage, no-till being one, strip tillage being another. There's a variety of other tillage practices. But that the whole idea is that we don't want to backtrack. We don't want to go back to full tillage and where we saw significant sediment losses, but that there is a way to maintain our conservation tillage practices and get that fertilizer in contact with the soil. So hence the shift in terminology from incorporation to fertilizer placement. And tracking land-based conservation practices. Well, part of our conversations and deliberations with the task force has been that the cost share programs in agriculture that come from the public agencies, both mostly federal but a little bit of state, is just get to a very small fraction of the agricultural acres of what we have. And that so much is happening on the private sector, but we don't know what those are and where they are. But it's always been a real challenge in trying to ascertain what the trends are, in large measure because there's significant confidentiality issues with farmers, and all for the right reasons. But for the first time, I think in my history of being around these issues, is that there was an acknowledgement that there are ways to do this and still respect and maintain the confidentiality provisions within the farming community. And a number of different suggestions are made, but that we really need to do this. And the agricultural representatives on the task force were agreeing to this and saying, yes, there's more that we need to do. Because because we've got good data that we can track things on the water resource side, but now we need more information on the agricultural side so that as we look at those targets on an annual basis from year to year, we can also be able to help diagnose that by understanding the trends of what's happening across the landscape. There's a lot of issues about different methodologies used for soil tests, and we realize there's a lot of important work that needs to be done here. There's essentially 4 different tools that are used for soil test methods. And just as one example is all the soil test laboratories use the Malick, either one of the 2 Malick approaches. They're cheaper, they're faster, and they're reliable. However, that Tri-State Fertility Guide was developed using the Bray method, one or the other of the Bray methods. And so when a nutrient management plan is getting written, it's often, we're not exactly sure about how all of those translations get made. And so one of our recommendations is that we recalibrate, that the Tri-State Fertility Guide be recalibrated according to Malick, but that also soil labs need to clearly note which method they're using and the source, and reference that source for the nutrient recommendations to clients. Because depending on which method that you're using would influence what recommendations get made to agricultural producers. So there's some more that can be done here that for clarity for agricultural producers. And then over and over and over again, it became critically important about what's needed in terms of research. And there's some work underway right now on some edge-of-field research, so that will give us a much clearer understanding of which practices individually and in what combination will make the most difference in preventing nutrient runoff off a field. We know in general what the practices are, but to be able to write a better prescription on an individual field basis is why we need the edge-of-field research. And then the Phosphorus Risk Index is an important tool that assesses the potential risk for runoff. And this is in the process of being updated, but it's also will be very heavily reliant on the results from the edge-of-field research currently underway with researchers at Ohio State and members of the task force. And so these things will work together, and the whole idea is to give farmers a streamlined tool that's much easier to use to be able to assess that potential risk for runoff. So all that to say, our report is going to be coming out next month, so stay tuned. But also, Jeff asked me to mention the Lake Erie Protection Fund, which is administered by the Lake Erie Commission. And we have funded a lot of different projects related to nutrient management and the algal blooms. But we also fund a variety of other a whole suite of other kinds of projects related to invasive species, to other water resource issues, both on the research side as well as on the ground implementation type projects. And where that funding comes from is the sale of the Ohio Lake Erie license plates. And so many of you may have seen the Marblehead license plate, and we just this month issued a new plate, Birds in Flight Against the Lake Erie Sunset, inside the life ring. But also to kind of make that identification, to allow people to make that identification with Lake Erie. So all of the funding the revenue that comes to the commission from the sale of the Lake Erie license plate, all goes out to grants for both research and on-the-ground projects. It does not fund any of our operational costs. It's all about research and implementation. So including research projects that you all may be involved with as you move on into your academic careers, but certainly also in the public sector for municipalities, townships, and universities, and a whole variety of different projects that we have funded over time. So with that, I want to say thank you all for your kind attention, and it's always nice to end with a photo of the lake.
So stay up here. I'm sure there'll be some questions for Gail.
Has the Phosphorus Task Force looked at some of the other benefits that might be accrued by doing some of these practices, like, for example, wetland restoration and the drainage control structures might help some of the flooding in, for example, the Blanchard watershed and things like that, because I think that helps to sell it to people when you can say, well, it'll help this problem, but it may also help this problem too.
Yeah, we didn't come at, from an analytics standpoint, we didn't come at it from a quantity perspective, only just from a standpoint of quantity as it runs off the field, and the need to sort of trap that water and sort of stop those pulse flows. It was interesting to hear some of the agricultural representatives on the task force talk about wetlands restoration, for example, because most of the wetlands restoration that's happening in Northwest Ohio in and around ag fields are funded through the public sector programs, the cost share program. Very little is done by individuals. And so that was sort of an interesting insight in terms of what sells, in terms of messaging to the agricultural community.
I got a question for you. How much of the problem and solution is coming from Ontario? We're from Canada. We have a vote out here. We just ran into these folks. They said there's election going on. So and the other question,
a captive I know.
There's another question for you. This is a bit of a dance, I think, that's going on here between crystal clear water, agriculture, the economy of the agriculture business here, across the states, basically. The fertilizer manufacturers who are producing this stuff are really interested in selling as much of this as you possibly can. So, and the federal, state, and private funding of cleaning up the problem. So I find this whole thing very fascinating, especially living on Lake Ontario.
There's a couple of questions in there, and I'll answer part of the Ontario, but you may...
Let's start with Ontario. How much of the issue is Ontario, and how much of the solution is coming from here?
I'm not sure about how much of the solution, but certainly some of it is coming from Ontario. And we've looked at the Detroit River loads in particular, and what's coming in from the Thames. And what we had said in the first task force was that while the loadings are high, the concentrations are low, and we need high concentrations to be able to see the algal blooms. However, there's still more that we need to learn about that. And this was some of the work that I was looking at from Dr. Herdendorf about how the Detroit River comes down in 3 plumes, and somehow it's hugging that western basin, hits the Monroe, Michigan power plant, those warm temperatures, and we're going to see blooms there. My own view is that I think it would be very useful that the issues and the solutions need to be different depending on which river basin you're in. The fact pattern for the Maumee and the Sandusky aren't necessarily the same solutions that need to apply in other watersheds. So the notion of Ontario being able to take almost a similar approach as Task Force 1, where you look at the comprehensive possibilities, a comprehensive list of what the possibilities are, and to identify where you can, the relative contributions, I think would be a significant contribution towards where we need to go in the future. But you may want to say more.
Yeah, there's another way of answering that. Well, first, recognize for the students in the room, whereas you have a number of states bordering the Great Lakes, and on Lake Erie, we're really dealing with 5 states that are impacting. It's only one province, and for the Great Lakes, it's all one province. It's Ontario. This map is a pretty good one in that this is an overview of the bloom from 2011, which was the worst ever. What most of us on this side of the border don't recognize is that the North Shore on the other side, where you see the windmills at night, and today was so clear you could see the windmills just during the day. But this is heavily agricultural. So this basin is very different than the other basins. The other basins are pretty much dominated by forest ecosystems, but this is an ag on both sides of the border. And the Thames River flows into Lake St. Clair right here, comes through a lot of agricultural land. And on this image, if you look at it, there's better ones than this also. There's a harmful algal bloom in Lake St. Clair, right where the Thames River flows in. And we can track that bloom all the way around the shoreline here. It'll hug the shoreline. This is a real significant concentration of phosphorus, but the load is smaller compared to the Maumee, because this is 4.5 million acres. The Thames is like a little over 1 million, I believe. I can't remember exactly the size.
I'll take your word for it.
But the Thames and the Grand are the 2 biggest that come in on the Canadian side. So the bottom line is there is a very significant problem on the Canadian side. What's interesting too is that we think of the harmful algal blooms as being real warm water forms, and so you think southern, we see them on Lake Erie because it's southern most, but they're having huge problems in the inland lakes of Canada. Lake Nipissing is having problems, even like French River area, places you would not expect to see harmful algal blooms. So it's really, it's not just even U.S. and Canada, it's very much global issue. And also remember that the algae don't care what the source of the phosphorus is. So in these cases, it's driven by agriculture. There are also places we can show you where it would be driven by forced retrieval. Other questions for Gail?
Just an agricultural producer, there's a few farmers sitting in here tonight. Can we do enough, do you think, and Jeff too, can we do enough to stay ahead of it before it gets too bad? I mean, can we do enough practices quick enough to fix this, or hope I asked that correctly?
Well, I think so. I mean, maybe I'm an optimist, but I also think that was what 2012 helped to show us. Was that, no one wants a drought year, certainly, but we also know that, again, if we can make a difference, and I think we can, that it will make a difference. So I think so. What's hard for us to know until we've got more of that edge of field research, it's like, at what scale, what's the scope and scale do we need more of these practices to change to see that difference? And we don't know the answer to that at this point.
We're looking for that heavy hitter.
Yeah. Well, we all wanted a silver bullet, if we just made this change, it'll all be better. But it's a composite of a lot of different things that has got us where we are, and I think it's going to be the same to get ourselves out of it.
We're talking right now forecasting. So when you talk about the forecast for this next year, this was the bloom of 2011. This is what we think the bloom of this year will look like. So you'll see it out here, but not anywhere near like we saw in 2011. It's about a fifth. Initially, I was not optimistic about us being able to accomplish this at all. And I thought, Gail, your point on what are the phases of this? It's like
awareness, denial, acceptance.
Yeah, because when I first started speaking with the agricultural community and trying to show that even though you're not putting more on, there's a whole lot more coming off the field, there was complete denial that, I mean, this can't be us. What's happened, though, over time, and one of our first speakers up here earlier this year has done a lot of surveys of the agricultural community within Northwest Ohio, and now over 70% of the farmers do recognize that they're part of the problem. And even more exciting, I want to say the numbers, 77%? Like 77% of the farmers are willing to do at least one more thing. And equally important, it's always a question of who's telling them. They're probably more likely to listen to Gail than they are to me. But it was January, I believe, the Farm Bureau came out with a really strong letter. And this is the Farm Bureau telling farmers to do that now. And that's a trusted source for the ag community. They're a lot more likely to listen to them than, the Director of Stone Lab or the head of the Phosphorus Task Force. And the fact that the Farm Bureau would do that. But then there were other things, too. I think you can't overlook the point that Gail made on the reduction in the flow from the combined sewer overflows. I mean, that's a big problem. But that's headed in the right direction. And then tell them what Scott's did, because that was...
Yeah, the Scott's Miracle Grow company, the lawn care company, they have a whole variety of different lawn care products. But they committed to a goal that they met this past year to remove all phosphorus from their turf management products. So there are still lawn care products out there that do have phosphorus in them, but the ones designed for turf management are now zero, the ones that are sold by Scott's. And they're an industry leader and hold most of the market share in Ohio. While a number of communities have, in part, what their response was, what they were responding to is a number of communities in the U.S. had passed, phosphorus lawn fertilizer bans, and that was creating a real problem for them as a company, understandably. And so they wanted to sort of be the first out there to say we're removal, and so they've accomplished that.
And Scott's is, you say Scott's Miracle Grow, Scott's Turf Builder. And if any of you you go into Home Depot or one of these places, Lowe's, and you were looking at a 4-step process, so you get a bag of fertilizer, in the spring you put on step 1. Later in the spring you put on step 2, and so on through the 4 steps. And you'll see your NPK ratio, three numbers on the bag. Always look on those bags, and what you're putting on your lawn should have a 0 at the middle number. And they all do now. And I've gone around and checked them, and that was really a big step. Now, it's recognized it's not going to solve the problem, because the lawn care industry was a really small portion of the load. But as we got into this, there was a whole lot of it's not us, it's those guys. Well, you can no longer point at lawn care. That's one group that's now out of it. And that's a big help in this process. Other questions for Gail?
You mentioned that different members of the task force are doing some of the research. How you guys do you play a large role in doing research?
Does the commission play a role? No, I'm not a research scientist. I'm a good process person.
No, even more than that. Gail downplays her skill. She has unbelievable skill in putting about 30 people into a room with a whole lot of different opinions, and herding us through it, shepherding us through it, getting us to reach a consensus on something.
No whips, no guns.
Yeah. She provided pretty good lunches, but there was beyond that. Gail, thank you very much. Last lecture of the summer will be next Thursday, same time, same place. This is always really, this a special week in that we have Dr. Pintor in year one, we hope, of 30. And we have at the other end Dr. Fortner, who next year will be 30, and Dr. Krissick is celebrating this year, or we're celebrating. This is 20th anniversary for Dr. Krissick. These are all neat things.
My 10th anniversary.
Yeah, this is and what's sort of equally exciting here, you have Dr. Kane out at Defiance, but Dr. Kane started up here in introductory aquatic biology?
Yeah, I took that one my first summer up here. And ornithology and intro insect biology.
Dr. Chapman, who's now our research coordinator and doing the research that hopefully will help us solve this problem, was up here as an undergraduate in one of our REUs. And so it's really nice seeing people come back. And John Hagman, who managed the laboratory for many, many years, retired about 2 years ago, and it's always good to have you back, John. So
I came here as a high school student and field trip, so
yeah,
go back a long way.
Yeah, it is not always a good experience to be. I was testifying before the legislature, and one of the legislators stands up and says, "Dr. Berger, I just got to tell you, I was up there when I was in high school." Anyway, thank you very much for coming. Look forward to seeing you next week. Look up and